And to complete the most significant news for this day, Y News continues. Here are the top stories. Authorities are urging the public to brace for the effects of Typhoon Ompong, which is expected to bring heavy rains in most parts of the country. Pag-asa says other areas that are not on the direct path of the typhoon will also experience rainfall because Ompong will enhance the southwest monsoon. The agency says monsoon rains are now being experienced in the Mindanao region, particularly in the Zamboanga Peninsula, northern Mindanao, Siquijor, Surigao del Norte, Agusan del Norte, Dinagat Islands, and Lanao del Sur. On Thursday, monsoon rains will also be experienced in Palawan, Bicol, and eastern Visayas. The inclement weather will extend until Friday and will include the central Visayas. By Saturday, monsoon rains will still prevail over Palawan, the Zamboanga Peninsula, and western and central Visayas. According to Pag-asa, Ompong is likely to reach the wind strength of 220 kilometers per hour, parallel to a super typhoon that can cause widespread damage to high-risk structures and heavy damage to medium-risk ones. Pag-asa also warns of a potential storm surge in the eastern and northern seaboards of Cagayan, which is likely to reach up to 6 meters high. A storm surge in the rising of the sea associated with the storm, it's occurred in 2013 during the onslaught of Typhoon Yolanda in eastern Visayas, where most of the houses in the coastal areas were inundated. Meanwhile, the National Risk Reduction and Management Council prepares a backup communication plan in case of problems during the onslaught of Typhoon Ompong. NDRRMC says this is to prevent communication delays and power outages similar to what happened during the onset of Typhoon Yolanda in 2013, which affected rescue and relief response. The agency also assures that major telecommunication companies will allow the use of their facilities and provide alternative communication lines when necessary. The NDRRMC says they have intensified preparations to achieve zero casualties on the course of Typhoon Ompong. Meanwhile, local governments in central and northern Luzon have started mobilizing their assets to anticipate for the possible effects of Typhoon Ompong. Provincial disaster agencies are currently deploying rescue and communication equipment, including lifeboats, radios, and generators, as well as heavy equipment to clear roads when landslides occur. The whole of central and northern Luzon are now under blue alert due to Typhoon Ompong. Local officials are also calling on the residents to prepare and to follow evacuation orders.
Lahat ng mga sinasabi ng ating gobyerno, ito po sana ay sundin kasi para sa kanila rin ito, para sa atin din ito.
President Rodrigo Duterte's economic managers will submit a draft executive order in the hope of addressing inflation. According to presidential spokesperson Secretary Harry Roque, the proposal seeks to simplify the process of food importation by removing constraints and non-tariff barriers when trading in rice, meat, sugar, and vegetables. A simplified process would mean faster arrival and distribution of staple food in order to stabilize market prices.
The Economic Cluster Group will submit to the Office of the President a draft executive order removing administrative constraints and non-tariff barriers on importation of fish, rice, sugar, meat, and vegetables.
And in other news, ousted Supreme Court Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno warns against the possible negative implication of the presidential proclamation that voided the amnesty granted to Senator Antonio Trillanes IV. Sereno says the move of President Rodrigo Duterte to nullify the senator's amnesty without consulting others, including the military, is dangerous.
Biruin mo namang buksan ang ideya na lahat ng mga amnestiya na naibigay na sa libo-libong sundalo na nagkaroon ng problema sa batas. Hindi lang sa time ni Cory, lahat pala yan ay maaaring buksan.
Sereno also says the administration might face legal problems if it insists in arresting Trillanes despite the Supreme Court's ruling on the senator's petition.
The Supreme Court has already called attention to the fact that there are these public undertakings that are consistent with what the Constitution requires, which is no arrest without a court-issued warrant.
Malacanang finds nothing wrong with receiving foreign intelligence information on the administration's opponents. This is after critics blasted President Rodrigo Duterte for letting outside services to provide wiretap information from the opposition, which they say can result into an impeachable offense. Duterte on Tuesday said there was a plot to remove him from office based on the information he got from a foreign country sympathetic to him. According to presidential spokesperson Secretary Harry Roque, foreign intel is part of the nature of diplomatic relations.
What I do know is that's the nature of intel. Intel precisely is intended to provide you information to avoid eventualities.
U.S. President Donald Trump vows an all-out response as Hurricane Florence heads for the U.S. East Coast. Filipinos residing in Virginia and Carolinas are also advised to make necessary preparations. James Montuyan tells us why.
Hurricane Florence, the most powerful storm to threaten the Carolinas in nearly 3 decades, is expected to strengthen, say forecasters. Officials warn there is a chance of life-threatening inundation from rising water over the next 48 hours as Florence heads for the U.S. East Coast. With sustained winds of about 140 miles per hour, the weather system is currently a Category 4 storm. It could make landfall on Thursday near Wilmington, North Carolina. Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and North and South Carolina have all declared states of emergency.
This has an opportunity of being a very devastating storm. The power is going to be off for weeks. You're going to be displaced from your home in the coastal areas, and there will be flooding in the inland areas as well. So these are going to be statewide events. The hazards will be statewide.
President Donald Trump said the federal government would spare no expense in responding to the likely damage from Hurricane Florence.
Any amounts of money, whatever it takes, we're going to do.
Meanwhile, residents in North Carolina prepared by boarding up their homes and stocking up on food, water, and other essentials, stripping grocery store shelves of merchandise. Many gasoline stations were running low on fuel.
We're going to be working all day tomorrow up until the curfew to try to get everybody squared away, and hopefully we can all of Wilmington can stick together and let's fight this thing together.
Filipinos, meanwhile, have been warned by the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C. against the possible effects of Hurricane Florence. In an advisory, the embassy urged Filipinos to make the necessary preparations and follow the advice of local authorities. Filipinos requiring assistance were advised to call the embassy at 202-368-2767. It estimated that approximately 150,000 individuals of Filipino origin reside in Virginia and the Carolinas. James Bontuyan, UNTV News and Rescue, Washington, D.C.
And for the news abroad, here's Stephanie C. live from Hong Kong. Steph, good evening.
Good evening, William. Mourners gathered at the memorials in New York City, Pennsylvania, and Arlington, Virginia, as the U.S. marks the 17th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. Kath Carriero tells us why.
U.S. President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence presided over 9/11 memorial services as the U.S. marked the 17th year after the September 11, 2001 attacks on Tuesday. Speaking to families of 9/11 victims in Pennsylvania, where hijacked Flight 93 crashed into an open field, Trump thanked relatives for their sacrifice in a patriotic speech that was interrupted by applause several times.
Each time we hear those chimes playing in the wind, we will remember the 40. We will remember their faces, their voices, their stories, their courage, and their love. And we will remember that free people are never at the mercy of evil, because our destiny is always in our hands.
Pence led the memorial service at the Pentagon, which was hit by American Airlines Flight 77, killing 184 people.
And here, on the banks of the Potomac we meet again, in this place, where the names of our beloved fallen are recited, where they're carved into steel and granite benches across these hallowed grounds, and it will be remembered forever in the hearts of the American people.
Meanwhile, mourners gathered at the National September 11 Memorial Plaza in Manhattan for the annual reading of victims' names. Almost 3,000 people were killed in the worst attack on U.S. soil since the 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. Kath Carriedo, UNTV News and Rescue, USA.
Rights advocates are urging world leaders to agree on a proposed declaration on information and democracy as they fight for what they call a crisis of truth. June Garin tells us why.
NGO Reporters Without Borders and human rights advocates launched a global initiative on Tuesday to urge world leaders to commit to a text giving guarantees for freedom of information and speech. An independent panel gathering several human rights advocates says they want to fight what they call a crisis of truth in democracies.
Democracy is under attack globally. It's like a global illness, and everywhere in the world, the press freedom, freedom of speech is under attack. So, as you know, journalists, decision makers, scientists from all over the world, we come together to face with this reality and try to find out solutions. At least, what can we do together to face with this global illness?
The Information and Democracy Commission wants to fight political control of the media, subjugation of news and information to private interests, and growing influence of corporate actors who escape democratic control, online mass disinformation, and protect journalists. Based in Paris, the Commission will draft an International Declaration of Information and Democracy, which they hope to present on November 11, when world leaders gather for the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. Reporters Without Borders met with French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday to push for the initiative.
There are democracies that become despotic countries without any attempt of coup d'etat, but just because some leaders, step by step, destroy the landscape for free, independent, and trustworthy information.
The goal of the initiative is to get the world leaders as well as private sector companies and civil society actors to commit to principles which will defend a free and pluralistic public space. June Garin, UNTV News and Rescue, Paris, France.
President Vladimir Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping demonstrate their cooking skills after their talks in Russia's far eastern city of Vladivostok. With kitchen aprons on, Putin and Xi fried traditional Russian pancakes, also known as blini, and tried them with seafood delicacies, including red and black caviar. Putin and apron showed Xi how to pour dough on the frying pan and turn pancakes. Later, he invited him to taste pancakes by adding Russian caviar. This is not Putin and Xi's first foray into batter-based cooking. During a visit to China in June, the Russian leader made a Chinese pancake which Xi tried. Brazil's jailed former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva ends his presidential bid and is allowed his running mate to stand in his place. Meanwhile, Ethiopian forces will be moved back to camps after the border it shares with Eritrea reopens for the first time in 20 years. Beverly Saison tells us why.
In Brazil, a former Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has pulled out of the next month's presidential election, allowing his running mate to stand in his place. Workers' Party leader Gleice Hoffmann announced the decision outside the police headquarters, where the 72-year-old is serving a 12-year sentence. Brazil's top electoral court barred Lula's candidacy less than 2 weeks ago due to his corruption conviction. The move comes days after a far-right candidate was stabbed at a rally. In Spain, About 1 million people have taken to the streets of Barcelona to mark Catalonia's National Day and show continued support for independence. The annual celebration is the first since Catalonia's failed attempt to break away from Spain last October. A sea of protesters wearing red shirts and bearing red and yellow Catalan flags banged drums, blew whistles, and chanted slogans for support. The turnout was roughly the same as last year. Tuesday's Diada holiday marks the day Barcelona fell to the soldiers of King Philip V in 1714, and for the past 8 years has been used as a rallying point for independence. And in Ethiopia, the leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea reopened crossing points on their shared border for the first time in 20 years on Tuesday, cementing a stunning reconciliation and giving Addis Ababa a direct route to its former foes' Red Sea ports. After opening the border, Ethiopian Prime Minister said his country's forces stationed along the country's shared border will be moved back to camps to ease tensions further for the first time in 2 decades. Since signing an agreement in Asmara, Eritrea on July 9 to restore ties, the Eritrean and Ethiopian leaders have moved swiftly to end 2 decades of hostility, which burned on after the 1998-2000 war between the two countries, in which 80,000 people died. Beverly Saison, UNTV News and Rescue.
And those are the news from the other parts of the globe. Back to you, William.
Thank you very much, Stephanie C., live from Hong Kong. A jar full of gold coins was unearthed in Como, Italy, which experts say is of immense importance. Leslie Longbowen explains why.
An amphora filled with hundreds of gold Roman coins has been discovered during excavations in a theater basement in northern Italian town of Como. The hull was found on September 5 as a dig was underway in the Cresoni Theater complex, which had previously been home to a convent. The 300 coins, all perfectly preserved, were discovered approximately 1 meter underground. They have been dated back to the late Imperial Roman era around the 5th century. Experts have said the find is of immense importance and the value of the coins is inestimable. The auroras could be seen lighting up the skies above the northern Finnish city of Rovaniemi just before midnight. And according to a local Northern Lights photographer, this was the best display of auroras borealis at the start of what will be a good season for aurora watching. The northern lights are a result of electrically charged particles from the sun entering the Earth's atmosphere. The phenomenon is known as aurora borealis or the northern lights in the northern hemisphere and as aurora australis or the southern lights in the southern hemisphere. Leslie Longbowen, UNTV News and Rescue.
And those are the reasons behind the news September 12, 2018. I am William Theo. Because we need to know, we will always ask why. Good evening to all.
UNTV, your public service channel.